Blood on the Moon, starring Robert Mitchum and Barbara Bel Geddes. I am now pleased to introduce today's host, the author and film historian, Max Alvarez. Max, please begin.
Thank you so much, Norma, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to New Plaza Cinema Talkback. We're very thrilled today to have a very special guest discuss with us an unusual category known as the film noir Western. When we think of film noir, we think of urban dwellings, back alleys, gangsters, nightclubs, femme fatales, coupes, police departments, and so on. But we don't often think of the wide open spaces in the 19th century. Yet the film under discussion today, Robert Wise's Blood on the Moon from 1948, is considered a film noir. This is the edgier side of Robert Wise, not so much the Robert Wise of The Sound of Music and even West Side Story, although that had some edge to it. This is the 1940s RKO Robert Wise of films such as Criminal Court, Mystery in Mexico, Born to Kill, The Setup, and by the late 1950s, I Want to Live in Odds Against Tomorrow, two film noir masterworks. First, let's get a sense of how RKO sold this film in 1948. I'm going to share with you the original trailer for Blood on the Moon, which would have been shown in cinemas in 1948.
Blood on the Moon, a peril-packed saga of the grazing lands, of stampeding cattle and ruthless men who ride by day and kill by night. Blood on the Moon, starring Robert Mitchum, who dares invade a gun-smoke barricade, an adventurous stranger with several notches on his gun, but none on his conscience.
What do you want?
Sorry about your son, Mr. Boyd. You can believe that if you want to.
Barbara Bel Geddes, who can hold back a man with a bullet or hold him close with a kiss.
You'll go now, unless you want more of that.
I don't want more of it, Jim. But I won't go.
Robert Preston, the man behind the unrelenting range war.
I've seen dogs wouldn't claim you for a son, Tate.
Here is breathtaking adventure, rough, rousing, roaring, to match an absorbing love story as daring and exciting as the old pioneer West.
Not a subtle trailer, but we don't expect subtle trailers from Hollywood studios then or now. So you have Robert Mitchum as a down-and-out cowhand who is asked by a friend to help mediate a cattle dispute. If you can figure out the story of Blood on the Sun from there, you are a professional narrative follower. It's very intricate. Sometimes it gets a little confusing as to who's doing what to whom, but it is certainly extremely engrossing, and it was engrossing enough to capture the attention of film historian and scholar and author Alan K. Rohde. We were very pleased to have him with us back at the end of 2022 to discuss the 80th anniversary of Casablanca. His numerous discussions with Hollywood artists and scholars and his blog One Way Street are viewable on his website, alankrode.com. He is the executive producer and the host of the Arthur Lyons Film Noir Festival in Palm Springs, which is entering or in its 24th year. He's co-programmer and co-host of Noir City, Hollywood, and Chicago film festivals, charter director and treasurer of the Film Noir Foundation. His latest book, Blood on the Moon, was released this past March from the University of New Mexico Press, provides an in-depth examination of a classic Western film and analyzes the post-World War II melding of the film noir cinematic style with the American Western. And I am going to pre-order and be the first on the list for his current book that he's working on, which will be a biography of actress Elizabeth Scott. I must have that book. His other previous books have been on director Michael Curtiz, and he programmed a number of important Curtiz retrospectives with UCLA and other organizations. He wrote a book on one of the actors appearing in Blood on the Moon, Charles McGraw, which is a perennial favorite. And you've heard him offer commentary on many fine DVD restorations of noir, such as Too Late for Tears and Trapped, Repeat Performance, and others. Needless to say, Alan K. Rohde, we are thrilled to have you back. New Plaza Cinema Online. Welcome.
Max, it's great to be back, and thanks for that very lengthy and detailed introduction.
I'm just getting started.
I need you to buff up my resume here. But at any rate, no, I'm just kidding. It's great to be with the New Plaza Cinema and with everybody this afternoon. So thanks for having me.
An absolute pleasure. What was it that jumped out at you about Blood on the Moon that said, okay, we have to have a book on this? Because this is about the making of the film, I presume.
Well, yeah, it's about the making of the film, but it's more to it than that, because as I got into it, and well, to answer your question, why did I write the book, or what captured me about the movie? I've always been a big fan of the movie, and the movie itself got good reviews when it was released in '48, and then it was kind of forgotten, and it would show up on TCM and would show up here and there. But in my opinion, it was really in the vanguard of a different kind of Western that was, I think, wrought by the post-World War II cultural turbulence that really changed what the American public was able to watch on movie screens. And so I always thought it was undervalued. And when a colleague brought to my attention that the University of New Mexico Press was starting this short series on this, and this was also during the depths of COVID. So this was kind of my COVID book. And, if Michael Curtiz, A Life in Film at 700 odd pages was a symphony, this is more of a concerto or a minuet. It's not a long book, but I was able to do it essentially from where I'm sitting now. And with the exception of, I was able to access all of Frederick Glidden, better known as Luke Short, all of his papers. I was able to access all the production files from UCLA that has that in their RKO collection. And the only thing that I had to go outside finally when there was a subsiding was going to the Robert Wise collection at USC and reading his script that had his hand annotations of everything he did. So it was really an in-depth thing. And then the discovery that, remember back in the days of laser discs,
I remember that.
1990, I still have some in my garage. Unfortunately, I don't have a working laser disc player anymore, but Robert Wise did a commentary on this film for a Blood on the Moon laser disc, and I was able to get the laser disc and then have it transferred, his commentary, to a DVD. So here it is, I have the director himself talking in detail about really the first A film that he made, because as you know, Robert Wise came up the ranks from, he started at RKO at the loading platform, humping film cans. To become Robert Wise. And I folded that into the book. So there's a lot more going on than just the production of this particular movie that I wrote about in the book. There's the career of Robert Wise, the evolution of RKO Studios, and how RKO was a very creative, small, Barbara Hale, the late Barbara Hale, told me it was like a college campus with all these young actors, a very collegial studio with what I labeled in the book as rotisserie management of all these different studio heads that came in and came out. And they were making, 40, 50 pictures a year. And it was really a training ground for a young person like Robert Wise. And then the change in censorship, the Hays Code that was by 1948 was chafing both filmmakers and the American public. So there was I felt that there was a story in the production of this movie and the movie itself, and how the movie was a forerunner of what happened to the American Western in the next decade, in the 50s.
Because you do see the origins of what we later consider to be the psychological Western, with those rather troubled anti-hero protagonists, really, who are carrying a lot of baggage and have some shady background to them. You get a sense of that in Mitchum's character here. He ultimately turns out to be not such a bad guy, but he's certainly leading the Western in a new psychological direction. And I do remember, it seemed to be in the early 2000s, you couldn't see this film on DVD, or it was almost impossible to find in the States. I remember finding a copy at a Paris bookstore in a French DVD edition, something to that effect. And so really it was forgotten for quite a while.
Yeah, it was. There was I had an RKO brand VHS where it was on a double bill with something, and they released a VHS. And yeah, you had to get like a European DVD. Another reason why I have two all region disc physical media players in my house.
Every film lover has to have an all region player. You just have
Yeah,
to.
yeah. Oppo is my middle name. Uh, but Warner Brothers released it finally in a Blu-ray, and it's beautiful because I believe they had the original negative as part of their library, and they acquired the RKO library some time ago. So the Blu-ray obviously is a big help. You can see the movie in about as pristine a format as you're going to see. And actually, the movie was screened at the Turner Classic Film Festival at using a print from the British Film Institute, because unfortunately Warner Brothers doesn't have a viable print, or a print that's available for theatrical exhibition. So we'll be showing that same BFI print I believe on August 9th or 10th during Noir City at the Aero Theater in Santa Monica, which runs from August 4th to the 14th, hosted by Eddie Muller and myself. So looking forward to that.
That's fantastic. Now, what is it about Blood on the Moon that makes it fall into the film noir category? Because certainly there have been many black and white Westerns before and after, with a lot of dramatic content, but a few scenes stand out in my mind that give it a noirish feel, and I'm sure Dan Cahill will tell us more about that later. But what is it for you that has film noir stamped all over this movie?
Well, I think obviously visually, and I don't want to steal Dan's thunder because I know he's going to talk about Nick Musaraka, but Nick Musaraka was the quintessential film noir DOP while he was at RKO.
That's
And
director of photography. Just one
director of photography, for those who forgive me if I slipped into a little vernacular here. But and Robert Wise, he deliberately he picked Musaraka because he wanted to shoot this in the film noir style. And the story itself, where you're not exactly sure what the heck is going on and what Mitchum is doing. And then in the beginning, he loses his outfit and everything as cattle stampede through his camp, and then he's taken down to the drover that has the cattle, and he finds out there's a kind of a range war going on, and who's allied with him. And so there's this ambiguity and these shifting loyalties where things are not exactly what they seem. And as the story evolves, you have shabby bar rooms. Wise film this basically at night. Betrayals, both romantic and personal, and family betrayals. You have friends that aren't really friends. You have government corruption. You have all of this. And I think I wrote in the book something to the effect that, instead of the back alleys of downtown Los Angeles and Mitchum wearing a fedora and a raincoat, he traded it in for the trails of Sedona, Arizona, and he's wearing a Stetson and chaps. But it's basically that kind of story. And Robert Wise, who I did get to talk to many years ago, and if you can imagine a Pantheon director like Wise taking a phone call from me, I was just a fan, and I got his number and called him up. And hi, I'm Alan Rhodey, and I wanted to talk to him about the Val Lewton films that he started out with, and Born to Kill, and his RKO films. And he stayed on the phone with me for an hour. I mean,
Yeah.
do you think that would happen today with Christopher Nolan or Steven Spielberg? I don't think so. First off, you couldn't get their number to begin with, but it was a different time, and he was just a very, very nice gentleman who knew everything about film, and appreciated his upbringing, as it were, particularly under Val Lewton, and how that whole look, that whole noirish cast, and a lot of this film was actually shot at night,
Mhm.
not using lens filters, but shooting at night. So the story, and then of course, as your protagonist, who is more ambiguous and better suited to a film noir than Robert Mitchum? you know, I can't think of a different name. So the story of the movie, how it was told, the characterizations, and most importantly, how it was filmed, all lend itself to that post-war noir movement, if you will, that was kind of an unconscious. It's not a genre, it's a style, and it kind of permeated things, and it migrated into westerns. And the westerns that I think we started watching in the 1950s with Tony Mann and Jimmy Stewart and so forth, this was kind of the beginning of that. This and a few other movies that I cite in the book, like Pursued, Ramrod, Andre de Toth, and Raoul Walsh, respectively, directed. These were different kinds of westerns. It's kind of like the difference between what's a crime movie and what's a film noir. And I think definitely Blood on the Moon makes that distinction, but yet it is still a western. It's still undeniably a western, and it's also a really good movie. It's very entertaining. So it was worth the effort writing about it.
And it has the convoluted narrative aspects we would associate with perhaps Raymond Chandler, where you really have to almost write down what's going on here. There are several what we call plot exposition, where the John Lufton character, played by Tom Tully, is explaining his side of the story, and then Robert Preston's Tate Riling character is explaining what's going on, and Mitchum is getting all this information from different people about homesteaders and land grabbing and who's doing what to whom.
Gunslingings and goons and movies, and all of this stuff. And yet what's good about it is the tempo of the movie. The exposition doesn't weigh the movie down. The exposition moves the narrative and moves the movie forward. And all too often, when you have films that have a great deal of exposition, it's almost as like the movie calls a timeout, and then you have a two-shot of people talking, trying to explain what the hell's going on, because you've had all this action and you've taken it in, and you go, okay, what does it mean? And so then they have to have people explain that. But in this movie, the exposition feeds the narrative, and the tempo of the movie just moves very sprightly along, which is good.
One of our viewers just made a fascinating comment in chat that it reminded them of Yojimbo, because you do have the Mitchum character pitting both ends against the middle. He seems to be jumping from side to side for his own benefits. Obviously, it's a little more, it's not quite as cynical as that, but, and of course, Yojimbo was the basis for Sergio Leone Western. So you have to wonder if perhaps
Wasn't Yojimbo the inspiration for? No, that was Seven Samurai, Magnificent Seven.
but Yojimbo was the inspiration for Fistful of Dollars, and then
that's right.
So
that's
there was
right.
definitely a Western influence there, and
That's
perhaps
right.
Kurosawa had seen
That's
this as well.
And the other thing is Frederick Glidden, aka Luke Short. His writing style, in fact, Bertrand Tavernier, the late Bertrand, he and I exchanged some emails, and he sent me an essay that he wrote on this that was not published, and he wrote. Glidden wrote in the style of a film noir, and his books had almost like that classic 3-act structure that is so common to Hollywood movies and Hollywood screenplays, and 11 of his novels were made into movies. Okay, and this was the first one. And the backstory on that I found very fascinating, because he was fighting to get a toehold in the studios, but he wanted to get paid. There's a story that hasn't changed.
Yeah, boy, things
a
are
writer trying to get paid for his work in Hollywood. How about that? And they kept RKO bought Blood on the Moon, and they threw it on a stack of scripts that my metaphor was that the studios in those days accumulated scripts like raked up piles of autumn leaves, and most of them were never produced, and they let them sit there, and then they were going to make it into a B movie. And then the guy in charge of the B unit, RKO, got fired because there was like this constant turnover of the executive suite at RKO. And then when Robert Wise and his colleague Theron Worth they wanted to get out of B movies. That was like trying to be stuck in AAA baseball, and you want to go to the big leagues, and you think you have the ability and everything, but it's kind of a thing of luck. So Wise's idea was, let's find a script that the studio already owns, because RKO is not going to go out and pay money for a property for these two guys. And then let's see if we can get it produced. So they found Blood on the Moon. They both read it, liked it. And then they went to Dory Sherry, who was then head of production, and he backed them. And in fact, one of the interesting sidelights was that Wise's own agency tried to undermine him rather than supporting him, and went to RKO and said, yeah, why don't we make it with Jacques Tourneur and Jimmy Stewart, and then Jacques Tourneur and Mitchum, and we'll push. And by that time, Tourneur was a pretty expensive director. But Dory Sherry fortunately took the high road, and he said, no, Robert Wise, this is his picture. He brought it to me. He has been working on it with Theron Worth. We're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. If only he had exhibited that much backbone when it came to the Waldorf Agreement and the blacklist, but that might be that my expectations might be too high. But in any event, so the movie, RKO owned the script for like about 5 or 6 years before the movie was ever thought to be made. It was just in a stack of discards that RKO had bought, and then they had the whole drill of bringing in different writers, and they brought in one guy who was a hack, and he rewrote. Well, first they brought in Glidden, and he wrote a script, but he wasn't a screenwriter, so he wrote this 160-page script that was enough for a 3.5-hour movie. And then they brought in another fellow, and he rewrote the whole script and turned it into a real hackneyed B Western. And then when Wise got a hold of it, he was able to bring in Lily Hayward, who was really a pioneer female screenwriter of whom most people don't know about her. They don't know about her history, the fact that she came up, her sister worked with D.W. Griffith. I mean, she was born in like 1889, came to Hollywood in the teens, and she started writing titles for silent films, and she went to Warner Brothers and did a whole lot of pre-code stuff. She wrote horror movies like The Walking Dead, could do anything, but she became a specialist not only in Westerns, but writing films like Black Beauty, The Biscuit Eater, The Proud Rebel, anything with a dog or a horse in it. She was very good at. She actually, one of her last movies was the Walt Disney film, The Shaggy Dog. And so forth. And she was a very, very competent screenwriter. And what she did is she kept Short's book intact. And she took out all of this stuff the other screenwriter had done and used mostly the book. And the only changes is they dropped the ancillary ranch foreman that has a crush on Barbara Bel Geddes, because it was kind of an irrelevant characterization. And then they cut out things like Charles McGraw's character getting assassinated with an axe, and then one of the gunslingers making a pass at a homesteader's 12-year-old daughter, and they took that stuff out for censorship reasons. And even so, they had a big battle with the censors over violence, and the signature scene in the movie is that fight in the darkened commissary saloon. Extraordinarily filmed, and Wise said it was his favorite scene in the movie, and one doesn't wonder. And between Preston and Robert Preston and Robert Mitchum, and the censor fought back viciously. And if Wise and Musaraka had done everything the censor recommended, it would have resembled like a Three Stooges highlight reel rather than two desperate men in a life and death struggle. So they were able to get under the censor limbo bar and do something significant with that scene, and indeed the entire movie. So, the story about the making of the movie is interesting, but it's really the look and the content of the movie and how it reflected the change in Hollywood, the change in America after World War II, and how the censorship dam, the studios were still wedded to the 1930 production code. But that increasingly looked like an era of whalebone corsets and buggy whips by 1948. And by that time, Joe Breen, who was the head of the censor's office, I think he knew he was fighting a losing battle, but he was still engaged in the fight. So they had a lot of back and forth over this. But fortunately, the filmmakers of that era became very adept at either circumventing or finding a workaround for the censor requirements.
We're going to talk more about that. We're going to talk more about the actors and some of the behind the scenes people. But right now, we're going to bring in our cinematography consultant, filmmaker. He's taught cinema as well, Daniel Cahill. Welcome, Dan. We'd love to hear from you on this film. Al and I are going to step out of the limelight a little bit, and then we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Sure. Thanks for the intro, gentlemen. This is the title card on the film. Lovely setup shot. But before we actually go into various things from this film, I want to talk for a couple of minutes about Nicholas Musaraka, the aforementioned DP on this film. Most of his career was spent at RKO, and he developed a reputation very early on for a noir look, even though no one knew to call it noir at that time. The pioneering film in question that he photographed is this little number called Stranger on the Third Floor. And there are people who will debate this till the end of time, but it is regarded as one of the first American American film in the noir style. That's the proper way to put it, I think. And I'll just run through a few frames. This handsome, charming young man was the star of the film, or the first lead credit. Here we have a chase down a stairwell. This is a nightmare scene. I just love the extruded buildings in the background as the protagonist's girlfriend is reading a bad headline. Again, this is a nightmare sequence, as is this, which looks like something out of a collaboration between Dali and Hitchcock. And here we have the archetypal chasing a vulnerable woman down a night street. So let's go back to Blood on the Moon. This was how Musuraca established his career that lasted well through his life. This is an extension of the opening title shot of the movie, and I will just invoke a few words to describe the mood. It was a dark and stormy night. And we can move on. Many of you may recognize that phrase from other uses. As if it wasn't dark and stormy enough, they have to give us a close-up of a totally miserable Robert Mitchum. And we identify with that. Nobody wants to be out on a horse in the rain. So he finally makes camp, and what happens? Well, this shot is a little hard to read in this frame, but it's looking over Mitchum's shoulder from his treetop perch down at a cattle stampede, which had to have been a rear projection device, some sort of optical effect. And soon after that stampede destroys his camp, he has a confrontation. We can see Mitchum on the left, and we barely see an outline of the man confronting him on the right, who is on horseback. We get a close-up of Mitchum here. Again, everything is so heavily shadowed. I find myself thinking that Nicholas Musuraca's favorite color has to be black, which of course is the absence of all color, but we can move on from that. Here is the following confrontation scene, and it's worth noting, I think Alan said something very similar, that this is basically a noir staging. And if they had been wearing trench coats and fedoras, it would look very familiar to us. But here they're just wearing different garb. The reverse angle, well, it's an over the shoulder shot, but I love the fact that it's also an over the rifle shot. So we're constantly aware of the menace in the staging of the scene. This is a face that is familiar to almost everyone in our audience. I'm not sure everyone can name him. He is Charles McGraw. And aren't we lucky to have his biographer with us today? Alan, do you want to share some comments about his participation in the film?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Yeah, Charlie, this was before McGraw was under contract to RKO in 1950 and made movies like Armored Car Robbery and The Narrow Margin and so on and so forth. And he was under contract to RKO just as Howard Hughes was condemning the studio to purgatory and turning it into a place to exercise his fantasies. But Charlie was actually a member of New York theater. He came to Hollywood in 1942, and I believe his first movie was The Undying Monster, where he played an English groomsman with a family menaced by a werewolf. And he really, in fact, Robert Wise commented, one of the things about McGraw, he had that very tough face and look, and he had a very guttural voice. And he really broke through after World War II as one of the killers in the movie The Killers. And apparently he used to drink with Mark Hellinger, and a lot of people drank with Mark Hellinger. And that really gave him a toehold. So in Blood on the Moon, he plays one of the hot-tempered homesteaders who are being led astray by Robert Preston with the memorable name. His character's name is Milo Sweet, which is a name that sticks with you. And he had the cigar, and then he had that bearskin coat that he wore throughout the movie with the beard. And in fact, Robert Wise on his commentary track, when McGraw entered the movie, Robert Wise laughed and he said, Charlie McGraw, that voice just matched that bearskin coat. And he also complimented a guy, I believe his name is Joe DeYoung, who was a Western artist and costumer who did a lot of the costumes for DeMille's films and also Shane subsequently. And he designed all of the costumes for that. And in looking at Wise's script, there are a lot of notations for every scene on how the actors should be dressed and what their wardrobe is, regarding how they're going to fit into the frame of the shot, the scene, the composition. And what reading through Wise's shooting script, he was a very, very meticulous man, as you would suspect. But McGraw actually had a chance to be somewhat of a second-tier leading man into the 1950s. He was the squadron leader in the bridges at Toko Ri, did a number of notable films. And then as Hollywood changed, the studio system more or less started to dissolve into television, and the antitrust case that took away the Big Five Studios theaters, he did more and more television, and he also coped. He was a lifelong alcoholic, and unfortunately that caught up with him, and he died in 1980. Tragically, by falling through a glass shower door, cutting his arm and bleeding to death in 1980. Very, very tragic. That was before the era of safety glass. But I actually got to know McGraw's last significant other, and I met his friends, stuntman actor Bobby Hoy, and his daughter, and so forth. And when I wrote my first book, it was a very serendipitous exercise because I thought this is a story that needs to be told. The whole milieu in Studio City with all the Westerns and the TV production, and he was all part of that. And being in Spartacus and the Birds and a lot of significant pictures.
One thing I did learn from your book is that on Blood on the Moon, he and Mitchum became drinking and brawling buddies for the rest of their lives. And they did meet up in subsequent films. But I think we really need to move on a bit here. So
Sure.
I'm going to go on to the aforementioned Mr. Mitchum in a very noirish shot. A lot of film scholars and historians like to point out that the shadows in film noir seem to entrap a character, and that's clearly what's going on at this moment. We're now up to the aforementioned iconic saloon fight in the dark, and it's kind of hard to see what's going on in a still frame, but that is Robert Preston on the upper left, having the upper hand temporarily over Mitchum. And then here Mitchum is beating the crap out of Preston, which is how the fight ends. But it's not how the scene ends. And someone is about to shoot Robert Mitchum when this chap intervenes, the ever-present Walter Brennan, and he shoots the other guy. So in so doing, he saves Robert Mitchum. And I think that's about all that I have from the film. I could have spent another hour talking about all of the cool noir settings here, but I think we're going to go back to our regular presentation. Max and Alan?
Thank you so much, Dan. And that's, although they call it a commissary in the film, that barroom brawl sequence is really quite outstanding. And aside from just the amazing camera angles and the lighting techniques that you alluded to, Dan, it's one of the few fight scenes where I get a sense that the protagonist really was suffering. But at the end of the fight, when you see Mitchum as he's leaving the commissary, he looks awful. He looks like he has been through hell, devastated, he hurts. And I just can't recall in a Western or a scene like that where that's done so convincingly.
There was minimal stunt work in that scene. It was mostly Preston and Mitchum going at it all night long. And yeah, they looked completely worn out and beat up, which is
that was exactly what Wise was after. He didn't want, stunt men falling over the bar, going through windows, and the classical movie fight with the two people fighting, bouncing home runs off each other's chins to no discernible damage. And Max, you're absolutely right. At the end of the fight, Mitchum has a really bad cut on his hand. He's had the crap beat out of him, basically, and he has to struggle to crawl around on the floor to get up to find his gun. And the coda to that scene is so great, where he walks by Brennan, and ostensibly Brennan and he were on different sides. And he says to Brennan, "Why did you do it?" And Brennan says, "I always wanted to shoot one of you. He was handiest. Get out." I mean, the whole scene is so well done, and it really, I think, elevates the entire picture.
And the cynic in me, when I was watching it, and obviously this is not true, but I almost got a sense that it was a different director. I mean, Wise's approach to that scene, there was a different level of confidence and intensity that wasn't present in a lot of the other scenes, which were more conventional, quote unquote, in a certain sense, in some of the way the scenes were staged. Or there was something about this scene that made it really stand out for me.
Well, they took the entire day into the evening to shoot this one scene. And you have to remember, is even though this was a real, quite a generously budgeted film at, I think $1.2 million or $1.4 million, if memory serves.
Not cheap.
There is a money aspect to this, where because of the bad weather in Sedona, and how Wise talked about, he was getting 3 weather reports every day on the Sedona Valley, one from Washington, one from the local, one from LA, and he said they never agreed with one another and they were always wrong. So they were chasing the sun all over the valley, where it would be raining or sleeting and so forth. And so consequently, he went like over $120,000 or $140,000 over budget. But there was no real pushback on that, because I think people understood the complexity of dealing with a remote location. And then back in LA, he was filming in Culver City at RKO for both of the interiors. And then he filmed in Encino out at the RKO Ranch. That's the town of Sundust, the Western Street, because they had about I don't know, 90 acres or something in Encino, where they had a Western town. And in fact, that was Bedford Falls, and It's a Wonderful Life was filmed there. And the 1939 Paris sets for Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I believe Howard Hughes sold it in '54. And then they had to go out to Corrigan's Ranch out in Simi Valley. And of course, you're dealing with wranglers, horses, stunt people. So for 1948, this was a very complicated film. And I always remember what Anthony Mann said: when you're on a limited budget, you go through the script and you pick out the scenes you really want to give attention to, and that's where you put your emphasis. And the other stuff that's routine, you don't spend your money there. You spend your money on the money shots and on the money scenes. And I think that's what Wise did with this fight scene.
I just want to inject a couple of comments about Robert Wise. I really understand and sympathize with Alan's description of him as being very polite and gentlemanly, because Mr. Wise and I are both born Hoosiers, and there's a certain gentility about even the middle classes there, and I understand and respect that. But I also want to point out that one reason he hired Musuraca was that he had worked with him before on The Curse of the Cat People, which was another breakout film for Wise. And even though it was decidedly not very noir, he knew what he was going to get from Musaraca, and he insisted on having him, and it turned out some kind of gold here, or something black. I don't know.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think there's also some speculation. I wrote about that in my book, and there's also some speculation that he might have been the DOP on some of the scenes that Wise reshot for the Magnificent Ambersons.
Right.
He had to edit it, and of course it was a small studio. He was familiar with it, and Wise said, you know, there were a number of DOPs that could bring out that dark and shaded look, but he said Nick Musaraca was the king of low-key lighting.
Yeah.
And he said, I normally don't use the same director of photography more than once, but he said, in this case, I really wanted Nick for the picture, and he added to it so much.
And it's worth noting, just parenthetically, that Nick got there with this style before some of the other champions that we've talked about, like John Alton. So,
True.
you know, he was the pioneer here. So,
Oh yeah, he started out as the chauffeur for J. Stewart Blackton, I think in the teens. Then he moved up to, like, I think a loader clapper, and I mean, he worked his way up. And one of the things I enjoy about the research in this book is how people like Robert Wise, Nick Musaraca, these were truly self-made men. There was no film schools to go to. There was no AFI. There was none of this.
Rich parents.
Yeah, Wise got his job on the loading platform because his brother worked at RKO. And his brother was the guy that made sure that all of the cameras and trailers were shipped to different locations. His brother's name is all over different documents in the production files. So his brother put in a good word for him, and he got hired at an entry-level position as, you know, a gopher. And then it was the sound department, and he was the one. Wise said that he was the one. His first job was dubbing in the beeps for the RKO tower and the RKO logo. That was
somebody
one of
had to
his
do it.
first job. Somebody had to do it, and then he took some footage for King Kong, and he and another guy, and they turned it into some short subject that he ended up getting a bonus of like $1,000. This was stock footage and footage that was not used for King Kong, and they turned it into something else. So all along the way he worked, and then he got assigned. He went into the photography department, and he worked for a veteran DOP who happened to be an episodic alcoholic, but a great photographer. And he said the way it worked then is that the guys that were really the directors of photography guarded their position jealously. But he said this fellow that he worked for was so generous, and his name's in the book, I don't recall it, that he said, when I first put up the film, he said, why don't you see if you can put this together? And he said that was unheard of. Normally you had to go through this long apprenticeship and kind of elbow your way in over a period of years. And he said, I was working for someone who was so generous, he just let me have at it. And, you know, I believe Wise edited the 1939 Hunchback of Notre Dame. And then, of course, his big moment was getting picked by Orson Welles to edit Citizen Kane as an editor. And he tells the story of being sent down there. They sent an older guy that Welles interviewed, didn't like, an older editor. So then they sent Wise down to talk to Welles. They were both about the same age, both young men. And this was the part of Citizen Kane where Welles was made up as the old man having the party at the beach. And he said, my first month with Orson, he was made up to look like, you know, Charles Foster Kane in his 60s. But he really appreciated what he learned from Orson and so forth. But Wise was a great filmmaker and a rare combination, a great filmmaker who was generally also a generous, polite, good guy, and knew filmmaking inside and out.
Many years ago, I did a phone interview with Peter Fonda, who had appeared in a Wise film in the early 70s. I think it was Two People. And he identified Robert Wise as the last gentleman in Hollywood, or something to the effect of
I can believe that. I can
Yeah.
believe that. Yeah.
and before we'll talk about some of the other actors, but a question for you, either of you gentlemen. Early on in the film, when we see the Mitchum character, he's on horseback, he's approaching the house where he's supposed to deliver the letter. Boy, that looks like Monument Valley in the background, but there's this big panorama location shot. Where approximately were some of these locations?
They were this was all those shots were in Sedona,
Okay.
Arizona, in the valley there. And they went there. They were there for about, I think, 10 days. I go through all of this in the book in excruciating detail on where everything was shot. But that was in Sedona. They never went near Monument Valley. That was John Ford's province.
Territory.
It was also expensive to get in and out of Monument Valley. Difficult, but no, that was all in Sedona. The scene by the river with Barbara Bel Geddes, where he shoots at her and she falls into the water. Some of the other stuff, then the stuff in Sundust was done, as I mentioned, at the RKO Ranch in Encino. The shots outside the commissary were done in Simi Valley at the Corrigan Ranch, and then the long shots that were done where he goes to the reservation and then they come after him, and all through the snow and the mountains. That was all shot in Colorado. But if you watch closely, you don't see any of the principal actors there because they weren't there. Everybody that was done in Colorado, it was a second unit. They're all doubles. And every time you see a close-up of like Charles McGraw and Preston on horses, that's against a process screen in Culver City. They did not do that, and the cutting of those sequences is very adroit. Like the whole campfire thing where Mitchum has Frank Phelan and is kind of holding him hostage. That was all done. That was all done on a stage. But the long shots of them trooping through the snow and everything, that was a second unit in Colorado. And of course, Wise was a peerless editor. And he had a good, I think Sam Beatley was the credited editor in this, but Wise certainly had a hand in putting the picture together. There's no doubt about that. And the fact that he was able to match all this stuff is pretty amazing.
Really is amazing how they do that. And
Yeah.
you would mention Barbara Bel Geddes. We Hitchcockians always associate her with playing Midge in Vertigo 10 years later to Jimmy Stewart's Scotty Ferguson. Where was Bel Geddes at her career at this stage when she made Blood on the Moon?
Well, she was essentially starting out. She had come from the stage, and I'm trying to remember. Her father was the industrial stage designer Norman Bel Geddes, and she had won an award, which was the Deep Are the Roots in 1946. And at that time, they called the Tony Awards, I think, was called the Donaldson Award. And she had won the Donaldson Award. And Lillian Hellman and Elia Kazan said, "Don't go to Hollywood, learn your craft." And she said, "But I like movies, you know." And she went to Hollywood, signed with RKO. She was in The Long Night, which is a very kind of oddball film with Henry Fonda, Vincent Price, Bel Geddes, Charles McGraw, and which lost like $1 million. It was a big flop. And then I Remember Mama, which she was nominated for an Academy Award. So she was coming off a Oscar nomination, even though she'd only made like a couple films. And unfortunately, about 3 months after Blood on the Moon wrapped, Howard Hughes bought the studio.
Mm.
And I chronicle that in some amount of detail because Howard Hughes was somewhat, he was on the way to being certifiable at that point. And he wanted to, Dory Sherry, when he sensed what was going to happen, he tendered his resignation as head of production, and then Hughes summoned him and assured him nothing is going to change. I'm going to let you do things. And so he took what Hughes said at face value, and that lasted about 3 weeks. One of Dory Sherry's pet projects was Battleground, that he had nurtured that film, and Hughes canceled Battleground, saying no one cares about the Nazis anymore. We need to make movies about communists. And then he told him to fire Barbara Bel Geddes because her figure did not resemble that of an actress. In other words, she didn't look like Jane Russell. So and so he quit, and he took Battleground over to MGM, where of course Bill Wellman made it, and it won several Academy Awards and was a big hit. And Barbara Bel Geddes went on to do movies like Panic in the Streets at Fox and so on and so forth. But Howard Hughes basically essentially destroyed RKO over a period of time.
And we have to remember this as we lament what's going on in Hollywood now. There were destructive forces that came in half a century or more ago, and the industry.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
We have to remind ourselves,
That's true.
Also, I'm a big Phyllis Thaxter cultist. I love
cultist.
I worshipped her from the moment I saw her in an Alfred Hitchcock Presents episode. I think I went on a tangent in a previous New Line, a New Plaza talkback. Phyllis Thaxter, around the same year, I believe she was appearing in Act of Violence or some other important noirs. And she is going to have how can I say, I sympathize with her the most out of all Hollywood wives, because she will end up being the wife to James Aubrey, the CBS executive and later notorious
Smiling Cobra.
The Smiling
Cobra, James. Yeah.
But
yeah,
Phyllis Thaxter, I don't know.
Another name that lives in Hollywood infamy. But yeah, Phyllis Thaxter was another stage actor from Broadway. She was in What's a Life, and who did she understudy? Dorothy McGuire and Claudia. And she toured with Claudia, and it was in San Francisco, and someone from MGM, a talent scout, saw her, gave her a screen test, and I believe her first major role was playing Van Johnson's wife in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo in 1943, which was also an early Robert Mitchum appearance as well.
I just have to say, my favorite Phyllis Thaxter role, you can probably guess it, is in The Breaking Point.
Oh, no, yes,
great in that.
That's when we last talked about her. That was it.
We could go on forever.
The spine of that. She's the spine of that movie. But she, Weekend at the Waldorf, The Sea of Grass. She was always playing somebody's wife.
Or sister.
And she got kind of typecast in that. The big advantage to Robert Wise is she was also a skilled rider of horses. And so he could use her, whereas Barbara Bel Geddes had never ridden a horse, and apparently she suffered from a very sore rear end in Arizona. And they used Ruth Brennan, Walter Brennan's daughter, was one of the stunt riders who actually doubled Barbara Bel Geddes extensively, because in those days Walter Brennan lived out in the valley for years when the San Fernando Valley was rural. And Walter Brennan's interesting. When he asked, "How did you get into the movies?" he said, "From hunger." Literally. He had lost all his money in some 1920s real estate deal, and he got his first part was being able to imitate the braying of a jackass in a movie because they couldn't get the real animal to bray on cue, but Walter Brennan could do that. And by the time 1948, he had been in 100 movies, had done or seen anything possible on location or a movie set. And one of Robert Wise's favorite stories is when they started doing wardrobe tests, and Mitchum walked in with the 2 weeks worth of beard, dirt, greasy hair, chaps, everything. And Brennan was sitting there in wardrobe, and he said, "That's the goddamnedest realest cowboy I ever seen." And of course, Walter Brennan became a legend. He had already won, I think, two or three Academy Awards for Best Supporting Actor by 1948. And the weird thing about him is he was this right wing. He was to the right of Genghis Khan. I mean, he lived way out in the valley. He built a bomb shelter in the 50s. He thought Joseph McCarthy was a great man. He prophesized conservative stuff all over the place. Great actor, great colleague, but who was it? Anne Francis long ago told me about making Bad Day at Black Rock. And I guess Brennan and Spencer Tracy got into it because Spencer Tracy was a very liberal guy. Brennan was an arch conservative, and they had these political arguments. And they ended up not talking to one another. And it was kind of like going to the director, "Could you please tell Mr. Tracy he's in my key light? Could you please tell Mr. Brennan that he has to make his pick up his cues faster?" And so they had a big argument, and Anne Francis told me Brennan walked away from Tracy when Tracy was telling him something, and he just held up his hand like this and put it behind his head as he was walking away, meaning, "I got 3 Oscars to yours." But certainly Walter Brennan was a great actor and a great character, but he was politically, he became this really arch reactionary during the 1950s, even to the point of being weird about it. But there you have it. It takes all kinds.
Yeah.
And how did the film do commercially after it came out? You said it was rather expensive for its
Yeah, it did well. It did well, and I think what helped it somewhat inexplicably, in retrospect, it had been out for a while, but then Mitchum got arrested for possession of marijuana shortly after the film was wrapped. And I go into all of that, and he was essentially set up. The Vice Squad had been following him around. His family, his wife and his kids were back east. Hughes took over the studio, had nothing for him, and I don't think it's any secret that Mitchum was a lifelong pothead. He smoked dope all the time, all the time. He drank and he smoked dope. I mean, this was a guy who was an autodidact, wrote poetry, knew literature, but liked to hold court in saloons with stuntmen and drink. And then he would bring these characters home with him at 2 a.m. And his wife temporarily left him. And so he got caught with a starlet and a buddy of his. And when they brought him down, when the Vice Squad brought him down to book him, they said, "What's your occupation?" And he said, "Former actor." So he never lost his sense of humor. But what happened is he got off. Howard Hughes rallied behind him. Got him off, hired Jerry Geisler, who was the big attorney fixer in town, who got Errol Flynn off on his statutory rape case and so forth. And people just particularly women, liked Mitchum on screen, and that kind of roguish charm. Even though marijuana was considered a dangerous drug in 1948, there had been a world war, millions of people killed, all kinds of upset, and people were willing to forgive and forget. And, you know, they brought Mitchum's family out, they hid him. Hughes gave him a loan to buy a house, and his movies were successful. And on Mitchum's part, he was always loyal to Howard Hughes. He stayed at RKO throughout his entire contract, making not so great movies that Hughes put him in. But he was loyal because he realized Hughes could have just turned around and tossed him on the Hollywood scrap heap, and that would have been the end of his career. But he did. Mitchum did his time at the county farm in Castaic, which was where some of the scenes for Blood on the Moon were filmed. And he ended up doing his time there, I think, about a month and a half. And when he got out, I think it was either Hedda Hopper or one of the columnists said, "What was prison like, Bob? What was jail like?" And he said, "Like Palm Springs without the riffraff." You had to love Mitchum. You know, someone asked him one time, "How did you stay married to the same woman for 40 years in Hollywood?" And he said, "I think it was a lack of imagination."
It was a colorful interview.
He was. Stu Whitman was his neighbor, and I had Stu out to my film festival some years ago. God rest his soul, he's gone now. And he was Mitchum's neighbor across the street. And Mitchum, you know, drank and did whatever he wanted for most of his life. And eventually the drinking caught up to him. His family staged an intervention, which embarrassed him terribly. And he ended up going to Betty Ford, the Betty Ford Clinic for substance abuse at that time. He didn't do well there. He left. And so Stu told me that he was over Mitchum's house for a neighborhood barbecue. And this was when, you know, Jack Elam, Richard Widmark, a lot of the old-time Hollywood people lived up in Mendocino near Santa Barbara. And so Stu said he was there, and he talked with Mitchum, and he said, "Bob, did Betty Ford do you any good? Did you learn anything? Did you pick up, was there any value to it?" And he said, Mitchum said, "Yeah, more ice." So, you know, when you fold the personal stuff in, and the fact that when Mitchum arrived in LA in 1937, it was similar to his arrival in the beginning of Blood and the Moon, where all he has is this outfit that gets wrecked. So all he has is his clothes. He's looking around for his boots. In 1937, Mitchum showed up in a boxcar on the downtown train yard. Union Station hadn't even been built then. And he hopped off the boxcar because he was hoboing around, got up there because his family had gotten a place in Long Beach, wandered around, and he found a couple hobos around a campfire, and he shared some wine and smoked a joint with them, and then hopped over the fence and figured out how to get to Long Beach. So Mitchum's arrival when he was 20 years old in Los Angeles almost mirrored his arrival in Blood on the Moon. And I thought that was kind of interesting.
And several other film noirs, probably, if we study the narratives. That's
the
drifter coming to town.
Yeah. Definitely. Mitchum said later in life, he said, "We didn't call them film noirs. We just thought they lit the sets with cigarette butts."
That's great stuff. Thank you so much, Alan. We are going to now be opening up the floor to questions and comments for our viewers. Just a couple of reminders. We have some interesting programming coming up. Our next talk back in 2 weeks on the 30th is going to be on Stanley Kubrick's The Killing. 2 days before that, or 3 days, on Wednesday the 26th, that's 4 days actually, on Wednesday the 26th, I'll be doing a online New Plaza Cinema lecture on the life and career of Kubrick. And then 4 days later, we have the talk back on The Killing. However, if you're in New York City and have the gumption to go to the cinemas, I hope you do. A week from today, next Sunday, the 23rd, we are going to be showing in CinemaScope at our cinema screen on West 67th Street, we will be showing Douglas Sirk's The Tarnished Angels with Rock Hudson and Dorothy Malone, and also Robert Stack. Dan is going to introduce the picture. It's based on a William Faulkner story. He'll have a lot of data on that. I will be joining Dan after the screening, and we'll discuss the picture and also take any questions or thoughts from you. So go to www.newplazacinema.org for more information on our screening a week from today and our online programs. So
Okay.
so
Okay.
we'll take some questions.
If anyone has any questions, please hit the reaction button and raise your hand. One of the questions was, where is the title phrase from?
The title phrase, and I wrote this, it says, actually the book itself, the original title for Blood on the Moon was called Gunman's Chance. And when it was serialized in the Saturday Evening Post, it was retitled. And it really connects the film to folklore about the autumn hunter's moon that appears reddish, or a total lunar eclipse, that's when wavelengths of red light bathe the lunar satellite in like a reddish glow. And down through history, a blood moon has been considered to be a foreboding signal or a portent of doom, which I think is an apt description of the world Robert Mitchum enters, hence the title. I hope that answers the question.
That's a great one. And this sounds like a Dan question. Could you talk about the scenes that used infrared and or filters?
I don't have that level of detail. I can only tell you that the scenes at night, like the scenes in the Sundust Town, those were all shot at night. They were all shot at night. So I know in Pursued, James Wong Howe lends that with Mitchum and Raoul Walsh directing. They did use lenses for some of the scenes outdoors in Gallup, New Mexico at night. And I do know that, but I don't know of any scenes in Blood on the Moon that used infrared or filters on the cameras.
I don't know that they had infrared at that.
And I don't even know if they had infrared then. And I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. The night scenes were filmed at night.
Well, there is a long shot. I should have taken notes when I was watching this the other night, but there is a long shot that clearly had a red filter over the lens. I mean, there was a filtering that went on the lens. In terms of infrared, Robert Wise will use that 11 years later in Odds Against Two. Yes. But it wouldn't have been infrared here. But there was some red filter for some of the daytime shots. One I picked up on. Yeah,
since everyone involved in this movie is gone, and basically you had to go off all the records, and the production records will tell you how many setups, what kind of camera, who shot what, who was called, who wasn't called, and so forth. But that level of detail just isn't available.
Okay, we have a question from Marjorie Gard. Marjorie, if you could unmute and start your video, please. Hi, Marjorie.
Hi, thank you. I don't really have a question. I just like to reiterate what Dan said, that the night photography in this film just blew me away, since that's the kind of photography that I love to do. And to me too, it was so obvious that it really was done at night, but the angles, the over the shoulder angles and all was just phenomenal. And also I couldn't think of another Western, even later, where they did so much shooting at night as this Western did. So that was really, most of them was done at day with the sun and the Monument Valley and all of that. So this Western was very, very different.
And when you say shooting at night, you mean shooting with a camera or with a...
Oh, yes. No, yes. Shooting with the camera.
No blanks.
Of course. Absolutely. Yes. And I did think definitely that it was really done at night. But another little thing I heard about Robert Mitchum, who was very funny. I think it was Loretta Young he was doing a movie with,
Oh,
and she didn't
Oh,
like
yeah, I know this.
cursing on the stage.
Yes.
And everybody, just that people know this one.
Yeah.
She put a box there, and anyone who cursed had to put $1 in the box, and he throws in a $50 bill and says, "That ought to cover me." I just thought that
Exactly.
was
Yeah, yeah. He had.
really
There was
so
another story. God, I can't remember the name of the actor who told me this story. He was making a movie with Henry Hathaway directing, and Mitchum was in the movie. And Henry Hathaway was notorious for yelling, screaming, berating people. He was just awful like that. And so at the beginning, he came up to Mitchum and he said, "You know, Bob, I'm one of these people that I get angry, I yell, I curse, and I'll do that to you, but don't worry about it. I don't mean anything by it, so don't worry about it." And Mitchum said, "You know, Henry, I'm kind of the same way. Only what happens to me is when people yell and scream and curse at me, I punch them as hard as I can in the face. But don't take it personally. I don't mean anything by it."
there should be a book of Mitchumisms, okay?
Well,
Well,
there is a very fine biography of Mitchum written by the late Lee Server, who was a friend of mine, called "Baby, I Don't Care."
It's a classic.
And it's
it's a great book.
classic, a great book. And Lee was a great guy and a great friend, and I miss him terribly. But
I hope the book is still in print. I don't
I,
know.
I think you can pick it up like in a used situation.
Yeah,
And it's
but
probably, hopefully, it's still in print. And I know it went into paperback at St. Martin's Press. But it's a really, really great biography, and I think he really captured the essential Robert Mitchum in that.
yeah,
He really
amen.
did. In fact, now I remembered the guy that told me that story was Bradford Dillman. The
Oh,
late Bradford Dillman told me that story, which was funny because I was interviewing him about Michael Curtiz, and he was in one of Curtiz's last movie, Francis of Assisi, and I said, "Well, so Michael Curtiz," and he said, "Alan, my mother always told me if you can't say something nice about somebody." And that was where our conversation on Curtiz began. At any rate, what are
Well,
you going
thank you, Marjorie.
thank you,
Uh,
Marjorie.
to Thank you, Marjorie.
Joshua, you
Yeah,
have your,
can I just ask a quick question?
of course.
Growing up in the Bronx and in New York City, we always looked forward to the Westerns and the movies when we went there on Saturdays or Sundays. That was, I think, because we lived in the city. I'm wondering, did the Westerns, as a financial thing, did they do better in metropolitan areas, or did they do well all over?
I think they did well all over. I think everybody loved Westerns, and how the Westerns changed, where they started with back in the days of William S. Hart and Tom Mix and the Covered Wagon, and it evolved, and then A Pictures went away as Westerns, and it was a lot of serials and low budget stuff. And then, like in 1939, you had Stagecoach, Jesse James, Dodge City, and the big Western epics or with stars came back. And then, as I wrote about in my Blood on the Moon book, it changed after World War II, and the protagonists became much more hard bitten. I think some of the Anthony Mann, Jimmy Stewart westerns, they make Jim Gary, Robert Mitchum as Jim Gary in Blood on the Moon seem like a good old boy.
Yeah.
Really, really tough. But I think westerns were popular for a very long time until until like the late 60s. And then it just kind of lost its cachet with the public as time moved on and generations moved on, and there was less identification with the West as part of the country's history. And you know, that happens now. Now the movies are all about comic books and comic.
Remind me the name. Remind me the name. I'm sorry. Remind me the name of the Mitchum movie where he is shipwrecked and washes ashore on an island with a
Heaven knows.
the nun.
Heaven knows, Mr. Allison.
Allison. There you go.
Heaven knows, Mr. Allison.
Filmed in my wife's country of Trinidad and Tobago by John Huston. And there's a couple stories about that. One is Huston had Mitchum crawling around on coral until his hands and knees were bloody. And the other thing was Mitchum had a scene, I think, where he has to jump into a slit trench on top of Deborah Kerr, who's wearing a nun's habit. And he kind of felt a little icky about like landing on top of a woman dressed as a nun or playing a nun. So he kind of did a little, you know, artful where he kind of landed on his side. And of course, Huston believed in casting the right actors and didn't give a lot of direction to actors ever. But he heard Huston say cut, and they're down in this ditch, and he looks up, and there's John Huston's head looking down, and he looked at Huston, and Mitchum said, more, John? And Huston said, yes, Bob, more, need more.
Just one observation I have about the death of Westerns in the cinema. Part of that was caused by the avalanche of Western programming on television, in particular in the mid to late 50s, where every network had at least three Westerns on every night in prime time. And it exhausted people. I just have to say that. I have many peers of my age who just never want to see a guy on a horse with a big hat anymore. So
I think it all, for me, it all depends on the quality of the show. I mean, I can watch Have Gun Will Travel with Richard Boone anytime. The episodes written by people like Harry Julian Fink and Gene Roddenberry, those things hold up really well.
Sure.
Some of the other ones like Dale Robertson and, you know, some of the other ones that, you know, they're kind of episodic. But, you know, it's interesting. If you look at Star Wars, the first Star Wars, it's kind of like a Butch Cassidy. It's a bromance kind of two guys. It's like a outer space Western in a certain way. I mean, I think the context of Westerns and a lot of the storylines have been grafted into different motifs, but a lot of the basic storylines Western used doesn't have the horse and the saddle, just like doesn't have the fedora and the raincoat. It has the Stetson and the chaps as movies evolved.
Someone had asked if you had anybody had any quick stories about Robert Preston, who's an antagonist in the film. He's the antagonist.
Robert Preston really, he said at one point, his Hollywood career, he ended up like doing very well at Paramount. He was under contract for a long time, but he said, I played the heavy in all the A pictures, and I was the hero in all the B pictures. And my late friend, Richard Erdman, was in a movie with him in the late 40s. And he and Preston were going someplace to location. And he said, he said, Paramount doesn't know what the F to do with me. He said, I'm tired of this crap. And Paramount finally was paying him so much money, they let him go. And he finally found, had a great second act with The Music Man. And that, you know, that kind of really he was able to showcase his talent. But he was a good actor. But I mean, he plays the cop who's Veronica Lake's girlfriend in This Gun for Hire. But everyone's watching this new actor named Alan Ladd playing Raven, a sympathetic killer. you know. And if you see that movie, the tone is he gives a cat milk in the beginning of the picture. So that tells me, hey, this guy can kill any one of a number of people. The audience is still going to be with him because he just fed a stray cat and he's nice to animals.
Because you can't quite dislike Robert Preston, even in this movie where he's
No,
doing
no, no.
not nice.
He's kind of a half-hearted
Yeah.
bad guy. I'm not saying that he's not good in the movie, but he's kind of a fellow hail well met. He's kind of like a Jack Carson type of,
Yeah.
you know, selling his BS to the homesteaders. I mean, he's lying to everybody. When you think about it, his character is lies to Phyllis Thaxter, lies to Mitchum, and finally, when he gets truthful with Mitchum, and it all comes out that, hey, you know, you're trying to find out if I'm with you or against you, and that's why Tom Tyler's hanging out outside to find out, and he's going to shoot me in the back if I'm not with you. His true colors come out. So I think he's good, but he wasn't a type that fit into all this stuff. He was a good actor, but you know, I mean, Hollywood, they didn't know what to do with Patricia Morrison. They didn't know what to do with a lot of people.
A lot of really talented people. They had just no clue as to how to.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. You know, Patricia Morrison, when you saw her on stage in Kiss Me Kate or The King and I, you're wondering what did Hollywood miss by using her as like the kind of the femme fatale in different movies, or the Sherlock Holmes movie where she's wearing the disguise and dressed to kill and so on and so forth. I mean, she's good, but they really didn't know how to use her, you know. Didn't fit the niche.
Well, before we wrap things up, I will have one story to share with you. I used to live near Rancho Park in Los Angeles, and my one regret in life, and I don't like, you know, you can't change the past, but if I could change this, I would. Every day I took a walk through Rancho Park, and Robert Wise walked in the opposite direction on his daily walk, and he was always so nice. He always nodded to me, and I nodded to him. Why didn't I say, Mr. Wise, I'd like to take you for a drink. I'd love to talk to you for a while, but
you should have buy him a cup of coffee.
I should have done that. I was too shy. But anyway, that was years
ago.
Yeah,
you know, I have those same regrets where I didn't. I mean, I had a chance to go sit down and talk and meet Jeff Corey, and I had to do something else. So I did something else, and then a couple weeks later, I'm in New York by the Strand bookstore, pick up a newspaper, and there's his obituary.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, I'll never get a chance to talk to him. So yeah, it's sometimes you just have to push everything out of the way and just say, you know, stick your hand out and introduce yourself. And that's when I showed up at Adele Jurgens's front door about 26 years ago, rang her doorbell.
But you got to do crazy things like that to meet these people.
Nowadays you get shot.
Now you're called
nowadays you get shot.
But if you're a well-meaning historian, you know.
You can tell I live in Florida, that's where my mind goes.
Of course. Well, someone wanted to know how Adele looked when you saw her.
Oh God, she was ill. She was ill, and tragically, she had lost her husband and her son and so forth. But she was very nice, and she gave me a 5x7 picture. Oops. That is signed. Whoops. That I have here. So I may be the only person in town that has a signed picture of Adele Jurgens and one of Crane Wilbur in my office. So, along with Canada Lee and a bunch of other people.
That's
so there you have it. Yeah.
Alan, we are going to look for your new book, Blood on the Moon, and track down some of the previous titles. I know Laurie will put up the slide again on how we can locate your work. We're so thrilled to have had you with us today.
Well, it was a lot of fun, a great way to there we go. A great way to spend Sunday afternoon with all of you in the audience, and I thank everybody. And one thing is, on my website, www.alankrody.com, I have a store. So if anyone wants to buy one of these 3 books and have it personalized by me, you can do that via the miracle of PayPal.
I'm
So,
on it. I'm on it right away.
or you can go to Amazon or whatever. The royalties all count, no matter where you get the book.
We're going to your website.
Okay.
There you go.
Thanks again, Alan.
Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Mac. Thanks for having me, Lori, everybody. Thank you so much. I really
We'll have you back again, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate that. One day I want to get back to New York and actually go to the theater there and go
Yeah.
to
We can't wait. We'll have.
Well, let us know ahead of time. We'll take you out to
of
dinner.
course. Of
All
course.
right.
Hey, there you go.
And the
There you
Strand
go.
Bookshop is still there.
It's the
That's good to know.
Yeah.
That would have to be as part of the itinerary. Anyway, take care, everybody.
Thank you,
so
Alan.
much.
Thank you,
Care,
Daniel,
everyone.
Lori.
Thank
See you
you.
Bye.
next time, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.